So I'm presenting this as a world of opportunities for experienced translators, but it would be really great if there are non-experienced translators or newbies in the room who want to stay. Just go ahead and stay anyway, because then you'll know what you have to look forward to. The reason that I chose to make this presentation for experienced translators is actually a very personal ethical choice, and it's just that I believe that if you're helping somebody who has a cause and you believe in that cause, you have to be the best possible person out there and the most qualified person out there, and just be very, very professional and really know what you're doing. Unfortunately, where I live in Argentina. I'm actually from Argentina, and I live there. And in Argentina, one thing that they constantly tell newbies and young translators is, well, why don't you volunteer for human rights organizations to learn how to translate? And I think this is a terrible piece of advice. It's a terrible piece of advice for the newbie, because you're giving this person a responsibility that they might not necessarily be ready to handle. I mean, it could be a very talented young person and someone who has a lot to offer to the world, but they might not be ready for this just yet. So they might need a little more experience before they can jump in. And also it hurts the organization. If you have an organization, especially in a developing country like mine, that is struggling to get heard and they're struggling to get their message across in the international arena, and they're doing it with incorrect use of language, it just makes it so much harder for them. So that's why I don't recommend the international human rights arena as an area to start learning how to translate, or, your first client should not be a nonprofit organization that's trying to denounce a human right violation abroad. It's just a little too much responsibility. And the other thing that I think you need to consider when you think about the human rights arena is that sometimes you're going to work in things that are really, really difficult to handle. So, for example, when I started in the human rights arena, I worked for an organization that was denouncing the crimes of the Argentinian military regime. And one of the first things that I had to translate in that arena were testimonies of victims of torture. And they were tremendous. I would translate a couple of words and literally cry. And I don't cry a lot. I mean, I don't cry a lot and I don't cry often, but it was just the sort of thing that it really gets to you. Sometimes you read things and they're tremendous. I'm currently working on a case. I'm helping out with the migrant massacre in Mexico, and it's about 64 people whose torsos appeared on the side of a road. And I'm looking at these pictures and I'm translating testimonies and I'm translating these stories, and it takes a really huge toll on you as a person. So that's another thing that I think you need to consider. When you're going into the human rights arena, you're going into some of the worst things that people do to each other. And you have to be ready and you have to be prepared to handle that. And it's a good thing to know that what you're getting into, because then you can prepare and you can figure out ways to be able to handle that. The way that I do it is that I'm very careful about having some time off. I take time off between one difficult case and another. And I also have a lot of dogs to play with. I have 5 dogs, and I play with them a lot, and they get my mind off of it. I know there's another dog person in here. They really help. We were actually thinking of making a session on why translators should have dogs. But you should have something to get your mind off of these things, and also remember that you're contributing to helping that. You're contributing to trying to help people overcome that. So sometimes we're directly in touch with some of the worst things that people do to each other, and you kind of lose a little bit of faith in humanity. You're thinking, oh my God, there's something so wrong with us. But then you remember, well, my client is trying to fix this. And everyone that they're talking to is also trying to fix this. And there are thousands of people that are trying to do something about this. And that brings a lot of hope into the equation, and it kind of helps you balance out the really negative stuff that you're going to be in touch with in this arena. But anyway, if you're a newbie, or if you're a very young translator, or if you're, at that stage where you still cry a lot, you might want to think about it a little bit before you jump into this. So, I was supposed to say this first, I'm sorry. This, like I said, well, I did mention I was thinking it was for advanced translators. It's going to be in English, obviously. There are handouts. The handouts are on the app. They will also be available on my blog. I'll upload them. I'll upload them on my LinkedIn, so you can check them out later. My email was in the first slide. You can ask them. You can send me an email and ask me to send them back. This is the email down there if you want to ask me for the slides. And lastly, I will be happy to answer all of your questions, but I'm going to just ask you to keep your questions until the end of the presentation so we can get all the content covered and then have a little discussion. So the first thing that we're going to look at, this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at changes that are ongoing in the human rights arena. The human rights arena is not the same today as it was a few years ago. And we're going to look a little bit at what's causing these changes. And these changes that are going on are very positive in many ways. But for translators, they're positive in the sense that they present areas of opportunity for translators who might not necessarily want to work for large organizations like the United Nations, but who want to find alternative ways to get into the human rights arena and start contributing, and who want to do this professionally and are not really sure how. So we're going to discuss these changes. We're also going to discuss where these areas of opportunity are. I'm not going to tell you specifically where to go, but I'm going to tell you how you can go about finding clients in the HR arena. And we're going to discuss the market niche, just a little bit, some of the characteristics of this market niche, and maybe what you might need to consider as far as training is concerned to work in that arena. And finally, just a little itty-bitty bit of contracts, because I'm a lawyer and I can't help myself. I have to talk about these things, but just a little bit, just enough so that, you know, you're prepared when you get out there. So as far as changes, there are at least 4 factors that are having a really strong influence in the human rights arena today. And these are the 4 things that we talk about the most. Those of us who work in this arena, authors who write about this, academia, they're all talking about these 4 things. They're talking about globalization. And globalization is a tricky word. Do we have a lot of people from Latin America here? Anyone from Latin America? Okay. Well, in Latin America, globalization has kind of a negative connotation sometimes. We think of globalization as large companies taking over Latin America and exploiting us. This is not what we mean in the international human rights arena. What we mean in the international human rights arena by globalization is just a lot of borders that seem to be falling in a positive way. We're communicating more with each other. Companies are doing business all over the place. People are going here and there. So we look at globalization, except of course there's a certain line of thinkers that share a very negative view of globalization, but this is not how I'm looking at it here. I'm just looking at globalization as a global factor that's just bringing people together. Privatization. Again, Latin America, raise your hand. We know a lot about privatization because during the 90s, a lot of our state services were privatized. They were states gave their services to private companies, and private companies took over things like our energy and a lot of other services that used to be in the hands of the state. And this was a problem for developing countries because, well, we have a lot of issues around that, like corruption and services that weren't working, and who do we ask for help? Where do we denounce these things? When people are they're paying a lot of money, they're getting lousy service everywhere, and suddenly it's not the state, it's a private company, but the private company says it's not really my problem, it's the state. So that kind of changed the arena a little bit. And what was interesting about this is that it brought economic rights into the human rights arena. So today, we can say, for example, that poverty is a human rights violation, and we can assert that, when we didn't used to be able to assert that as easily a few years ago. Feminization. Feminization of human rights means that we have finally figured out that women are a good way to overcome world poverty. I mean, congratulations, they finally realized that women produce the largest part of the world's wealth, and we have access to the smallest portion of that world's wealth. And countries that are trying to overcome extreme poverty and are doing a good job at that are actually doing a good job at that by giving credit to women. They have microcredits. So, for example, a client of mine created a bank in India that gives microcredits to women. And these credits work in a way where groups of women get together and they have projects and they bring them all together, and that's how they're overcoming poverty little by little in very underdeveloped nations. And lastly, there's fragmentization, which is what happens when a state no longer wants to belong to another state. There are countries that today one would say, well, this is a country, but the international arena does not want to recognize them as countries. They're saying, well, no, you still belong to whatever country. And they're saying, well, no, we don't belong to that country. We're an independent nation. Look, we meet all the requirements. But the UN is saying, well, yeah, you meet all the requirements except recognition. So, countries are trying to get recognized, and these countries need translators and they need interpreters to help them get recognized. So I know my voice sounds shaky, but it's just because I'm freezing up here. I have to admit, there's just this cold breeze coming straight at my back. It's killing me. So these two fundamental changes, these factors led to two fundamental changes, and I'm going to talk about them individually. Am I on the right slide here? Yes, okay. So we have new actors in the international human rights arena, and we have international human rights are no longer viewed solely as claims against states. And this is really interesting because one of the things that's starting to happen is that we're starting to claim that companies can also violate our human rights. I'm going to get into that in the next slide, but I'm going to start with new actors that are in the human rights arena, because new actors translates into potential clients for translators. The UN, for example, has recently started recognizing certain nonprofit organizations as persons who can actually come to hearings before the UN. And this didn't used to happen. We are now calling on NGOs, we're calling on smaller organizations, we're calling on NSAs, which are non-state actors, and they're being invited to the international arena to formally denounce human rights violations in the name of groups that don't have representation in their countries. And this is where the area of opportunity is for translators, because if you believe in a certain cause, and you want to help those organizations, you can help them get their message across when they have to come over to the UN or to any other international organization and participate in the process of denouncing human rights violations. And the second implication is because human rights are no longer viewed as claims against states, then we have new types of petitions and we have new types of documents that did not used to be part of the international human rights system, and they now are part of the human rights system, and those documents need translating. And when those documents actually find their way into different international bodies, then they're also accompanied by interpreters. Representatives bring their interpreters with them if it's not an official language of the United Nations. So you have areas of opportunity for both translators and for interpreters. Before I get into that, I was going to tell you about, I want to go back to this one, where I was saying about new state actors. The other phenomenon that's really interesting, and it's going to be particularly relevant for Americans here in the US, of thinking of whether or not companies can be denounced for human rights violation, is because this is a very new question for us. But it's a new question that we're just starting to ask ourselves, but not because it's a new issue, just because we didn't used to ask ourselves this question. So, for example, in Argentina, the company Ford, the car maker, actually they actually lent their facilities and resources to the military regime that had taken over Argentina during the last dictatorship. And these facilities were used as illegal detention centers, and that's where people were being tortured and detained. So, for example, one question that Argentina is asking, well, what can we do about Ford? Because, the state was the one doing it, but there were private companies that were helping them. And this is something that goes on in a lot of countries, especially in developing countries. So for those of you who come from developing countries, when you have transnational organizations, transnational companies in your country, you might want to look at what's going on as far as companies being held responsible for human rights violations. So the specific areas of opportunity, the most obvious are chartered and treaty-based bodies. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that. Charter-based bodies include the Human Rights Council and special procedures. They have very, very clear, not so clear, they say they're clear, they're very broad. They have very, very broad, but they just use words that are easy to understand. So it seems like it's clear, but it's really not. Their objectives are to prevent abuse, inequity, and discrimination, and protect the vulnerable and expose perpetrators. So you when you read that, it seems like it makes sense, right? But we don't really know what that means. We're not exactly sure. In practice, it's a little confusing. But when you look at these objectives, you can figure out what kind of organizations are working in the human rights arena. So, for example, let's say that the issue that you really care about is discrimination. Then there might be an organization in your area that is working toward fighting discrimination and that are trying to actively participate in the human rights arena. So that's a door that you might want to go knock on and say, hey, I'm a professional translator, I can help you. Okay, so that's why I think it helps to always look at these objectives and declarations, because it gives you an idea of where to look. For example, in Argentina right now, and not just Argentina, I was talking to somebody in Guatemala who said they're having the same problem. We, for instance, stopped counting our poor. We have so many people below the poverty line at this point that the government is not counting it anymore. So, of course, we sued the government, and the Minister of Economy said, well, we can't count them. There's just too many of them. You know, so we're taking this, of course, to the international court because our local courts are not able to help. So when you think of these objectives, well, obviously the poor are vulnerable. And just think about things that go on where you live, what's going on. Do you have people living on the street? Do you have people who are left out of the system? Do you have people who are not receiving health care? Do you have people who don't have access to education? There is a high chance that where you are, there are a lot of human rights violations going on because they happen everywhere. And if you pay enough attention to what's going on in your area and you think about, you know, these objectives, you might find organizations near you who are helping with these issues that you might want to work with. In addition to that, charter-based bodies have 39 thematic mandates. This means that there are 39 little committees and subcommittees and things that are trying to fix stuff from inside these organizations. So your client might be working with one of these thematic mandates or toward one of these. And then we have 14 country mandates. So again, you can work at a state level. Not necessarily, of course, inside an organization if you want to be an external translator or interpreter. The treaty-based bodies, there are 9 core international human rights treaties. So that it's a lot to choose from. And what I would recommend is that you look into what these 9 treaties are, and from there you'll be able to find, you might already have a cause that you're interested in that you want to join and help out, but you know, you might want to check out what the 9 core treaties are and choose one and find an organization that is working toward that one treaty that you're interested in. If you're going to help that organization and you're going to be a translator and interpreter working on that particular issue, then what I also recommend is learn everything there is to learn about that treaty. I mean, just read everything. Read the treaty, read comments on the treaty, read what academics say on that, read what your client has been publishing in their own language about that. I mean, you really need to know that. And these 9 core international rights treaties work through 10 different treaty bodies. So you have 10 different things 10 different areas that you can look at. The 10th treaty body is the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture. So for those of us who come from countries that have had military regimes, we have a lot of areas of opportunity to work with organizations that are trying to somehow compensate society for past experiences with torture or things that our governments have done. Here in the US, of course, you have the whole thing that happened during the Bush administration. So you have organizations in the US that are also working toward fixing that problem. The most recent one is on enforced disappearance. Enforced disappearance is a very big issue in Latin America. It's starting to be somewhat of an issue in Canada with the disappearance of Native women. So if you're in Canada, that's something that you might want to look into. Since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, all UN member states have ratified at least one core human rights treaty. So if you're here in the US, you might want to check out, well, which human rights treaty did the US ratify? And you check out the treaties that they ratified. You can look at which topic you're interested in and then try to find organizations that are working toward that. 80% have ratified 4 or more treaties. So that's a lot. That's a lot of, I mean, it's people worrying about a lot of issues. You have a lot of things that you can look into. As far as the market niche, the United Nations has the United Nations has its own official languages: English, French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, and Chinese. The only languages for which they provide interpreters and official translators are those official languages. This means that if your client wants to go before the UN to denounce a human rights violation, The UN will take over if it's these languages. You'll need to be a UN interpreter or translator. But if not, then your client will have to provide absolutely all the paperwork in one of the official languages of the United Nations for them to even consider listening to them. And if they go to a hearing, they'll need to have a translator who can translate into one of these languages, or they'll work with, I meant interpreters. They'll work with interpreters who will interpret, several different, like a little chain of languages. But basically, this means that everything outside of these languages, all the documents that come in and out of these bodies come in and out in these languages, and that is a huge linguistic area of opportunity. So do we have anyone here that does not work in these language pairs? Okay, so you guys have a lot of work that you can do in this arena. I mean, you can look at it from a linguistic perspective. If the speaker, like I said, doesn't speak any of these languages, I already told you that part. I'm not going to go back to that. Now, I mentioned earlier non-state actors. What we mean by non-state actors can be really confusing. If you look up the term non-state actors, it can mean a lot of different things, and it depends on where you're looking at that from. So when we look at a non-state actor from the point of view of human rights specifically, or just the HR arena, what is active in terms of human rights, you have your community-based organizations. There are very small community-based organizations that constantly denounce violations before the UN. So, for instance, I have a client that is in Peru. It's a very, very small organization in Peru, and they work towards sexual and reproductive rights of women. They have what they denounce before the UN is abortion used as torture. It's very interesting, the phenomenon that happens there. They have very, very elevated numbers of rape. There are a lot of cases that are tried for rape, and abortion is illegal in Peru, even in cases of rape. So when women who have been raped go and get an illegal abortion, and then something goes wrong with that abortion, then doctors don't want to treat them. And not only do they not want to treat them, they also use procedures that are particularly painful and then just torture them with the idea of, well, you're trying to get an abortion. And this is, for instance, one of the issues that's being denounced. And it's a very small organization, but they're constantly, reaching out to the UN. You also have women's rights groups. Like I said, feminization of human rights is a very big deal right now. So if you work with women's rights organizations, you'll have a lot of work to do. For those of us that are in Latin America, we have increasing numbers of homicide and homicide against women, which we call femicide. So, we are really killing very large numbers of women in Latin America that are dying very violently at the hands of their spouses or even police officers when they denounce. Sometimes, for example, I have a client in Ecuador that denounces cases of women who have been beaten by their husbands, and then when they go to the police and they try to report that, then they get beaten by the police. Because what are you doing? You're trying to denounce your husband. What kind of wife are you? And that's the solution that they get, is they get beaten by the police. So, you have these issues that are going on. That's something else that you might want to consider working on. You have groups and organizations that use the name, we are a human rights group. And they actively say, this is what we do. You have organizations that don't use the word human rights group. Sometimes they hide behind other words. For example, in Argentina, again, it's where I live, so that's why I give you so many examples. But in Argentina, our current government used human rights in a very positive way at the beginning, and then it kind of was not so positive anymore, as sort of a trump, as sort of a card to just show, all the wonderful things that they were doing. And there were some very, very good, some of the cases were handled very well. But then they made such a big deal out of it, and they broadcasted it so much that now we have the opposite phenomenon where people in Argentina just don't want to hear about human rights anymore. So some human rights organizations actually cannot call themselves human rights organizations, because if they use the word human rights, then people automatically assume that they have something to do with the current government and they don't want to help them. So, you need to look into, depending on where you are they using the name human rights or are they not using the name human rights? If you're familiar with the treaties, with the 9 treaties that I mentioned earlier, then you'll know. You can just look at what cause they're working toward and whether or not they use the word human rights in their name, they might still be working in the human rights arena. Religious organizations oftentimes also contribute to the human rights arena. I don't know if is anyone here familiar with Red Tea? Yeah, okay. Well, Red Tea, for instance, recently called out to the Pope to help translators and interpreters in conflict zones that are being left behind. When troops come back to their country, sometimes the translators and interpreters are left behind and they're tortured and killed. So Red Tea is a nonprofit organization that advocates for these translators and interpreters, and they have asked for help from religious organizations, in addition to, of course, the UN and other human rights bodies. Farmers' cooperatives, this is particularly important in developing countries. Does anyone live in a developing country? Yeah, okay, well, those of us who live in developing countries, farmers' cooperatives actually are very active in the human rights arena. Trade unions are very active in the human rights arena. Universities, of course, what universities do is mostly academic stuff. I, for example, am the editor of a law journal, and we just write a lot about human rights and try to get people to read us. And a lot of people don't want to read us because it's too academic, but we still try. But the good thing about that is that when you contribute to academic knowledge, what you're doing is somehow influencing actual actors who are working inside these organizations because they read us. I mean, you don't read us, like the general public will not pick up a law journal, but somebody who works inside the UN or a decision maker will pick up a law journal, and they will read what we write, and they'll think about what we're recommending. And sometimes they listen to us, sometimes they even quote us in their decisions. So if you're interested in academic translation and human rights, you can bring those two together, and that's another area of opportunity for you. And of course, research institutions, people that actually do the research that we need, that gather those numbers and, figure out what's going on and where and how. And then the rest of us use that information to write our reports and to go around advocating for whatever it is that we're advocating for. So, all of these non-state actors and states participate in something that's called the United Nations Periodic Review. And the UN Periodic Review is relatively new. It has not been around forever. I cannot remember right now what year, but we're on the second review period. But it consists of the Human Rights Council looking into human rights violations throughout the world. And all UN member states get evaluated during the UN Periodic Review. And what happens during the review is that states will issue a report to the council, and they will tell us how lovely and wonderful they are, and how nobody's human rights are being violated anywhere. We're doing everything perfectly well. And then non-state actors will jump in, and they will provide shadow reports, and they'll say things like, okay, well, no. I mean, yeah, okay, maybe they fixed something here or there, but... And that but has a lot of information that is very helpful to the council in evaluating the situation in a country, but also in issuing recommendations for that country. So, once the country submits their report, and then you get all the shadow reports from your different actors, you have your hearings, everybody discusses things, and then they issue recommendations, and they tell you, well, this is what you should be working on. And sometimes they take further action. So the periodic review is conducted by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council will listen to states and troikas. Troikas are little groups of 3 states that will participate in a country's review process. And of course, they will listen to their non-state actors. The purpose is to improve the human rights situation in every country. That's kind of tough. I mean, you can't really improve the human rights situation in every country, but that's what they set out to do. They're trying to, and this includes every country, even countries that are not UN member states. I mean, they really are trying to get out there and just improve the human rights situation for everyone. And what they try to do there is align local law. This is wrong here. This should say international law and domestic law. What they try to do is they look at the laws in a country, and they look at international laws, and they will issue recommendations on how we can make our domestic law meet the standards of international law. So obviously what I'm going to say next is you really have to know your legal stuff. I mean, you have to know a lot of legal vocabulary. You really have to know your local legal system. Because if you don't understand your system, you can make mistakes in your translation that can be very, very hard to overcome for your client if they're facing a hearing. But it is a very good area of opportunity for linguists, because if you are experienced and you do understand your legal system and you understand international law, then you can be very helpful in that arena, and you can even make recommendations that go a little bit beyond just language stuff. You can actually help your client explain their system to the council. So what happens in the council is that the council members, they don't know, the law of Argentina or the law of Peru or any other country. So in these reports, you have to explain it to them. And sometimes people are not, especially lawyers, and I know I am one, but sometimes we just don't explain ourselves correctly, or we have a hard time focusing on what's relevant and what can render something intelligible to someone who is not familiar with our system. So a very good and experienced translator can also be a consultant in that, in that sense, where you can help them develop better reports and actually make suggestions. So the UN, like I said, periodic review consists of different cycles. It's currently on its second cycle, and the second cycle is almost over. In the second cycle, they've already evaluated 42 countries, and they've already held 14 sessions. But if you visit the UN Periodic Review site, you can check if your country is up for evaluation. So whether you want to work for the state directly or you want to work for an NSA that's going to be participating in the next process, it takes them several years to develop all these reports. And it's a lot of work. I mean, it takes a long time. The process is short, but all that development takes a really long time. So what you can do, what I would recommend, is to go into their calendar. It's online. It's, I don't remember the page, but if you look up UN Periodic Review, and you can just look up what countries are up for evaluation, you'll see when your country is being evaluated, and you can figure out ways that you can jump in. So qualifying for the niche. You'll notice that I put a little star next to law degree. I don't necessarily think that you have to have a law degree to be able to help out with translation in this arena. What I do think, though, is that if you don't have a law degree, you do have to make an extra effort to, like I said earlier, really understand the law and really understand international law. So if you're a lawyer but you don't know international law, you're still going to have some problems, because you need to understand how your domestic law plays in with international law. And you're going to need to be able to handle very complicated vocabulary. Sometimes the exact same phrase, for example, in Spanish, we have one phrase that means one thing in my domestic system, but it means something completely different in the international system, and the only thing that changes is one little preposition. So, it can really make a big difference. You have to really know your language, and you have to know the treaties inside out and know how each committee and how each assembly has interpreted that language. So, like I said, you don't have to have a law degree, but you have to really know your stuff. Translation and training degree, I kind of think that it would help to have, I know that a lot of translators don't have degrees in translation, but they have certification. Certification helps. But if you have neither a degree in translation nor certification, then you really should figure out a way to compensate for that and just really become an expert in translation in that field. Because like I said, these are human rights have to do with the worst things that happen to people. So it's something that's not to be taken lightly. We have to be very responsible when we're working in that arena. And we have to be experts in whatever it is that we're doing. Proficiency in at least one of the 6 languages, of course, helps because your client is going to want to participate and they're going to want to do it in one of those 6 languages. I would say that English is the dominant language, even though they have 6 official languages. Most of the organizations that try to reach out to the international arena will try to do it in English. They will automatically just go for that language. Knowledge of your local law or your domestic law, however you want to call it. You need to know what the law says, and knowledge of international law, especially human rights law. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about are contracts. You have 2 different roles. There are 2 different types of contracts that you normally enter into. You either work directly for these organizations, in which case you work for them, or you can work externally. I, for example, work externally. I like to put pressure on them. I don't want to join them. I just want to pressure them into doing things. So it depends on you, whether you want to actually join the organization or you want to work for someone outside. The difference is that you're either going to be an in-house or you're going to be a freelancer. And then, of course, you can work for states and you can work for non-state actors. So depending on whether you're working directly for the state or you're working for a non-state actor, you're going to enter into different kinds of agreements. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind. Who's going to be paying you, who you're going to be working with. And of course, another thing that you need to evaluate are possible conflicts of interests. So for example, I work for a lot of nonprofit organizations that denounce human rights violations in a specific country. So then if that state contacts me and they want me to translate their official reports, there's a conflict of interest. I can't accept that, even as a freelancer, because, I'm representing the other guy that is telling the UN that everything that this government is saying is not true. So, it's an ethical question, but it also translates into your contracts because smart organizations will actually make you sign that. They'll make you sign something that says, well, you're not going to translate for the state. You're just going to translate for us, the denouncers. Contracts and fees, I'm not going to tell you numbers, of course, but what I am going to tell you is that non-state actors that work in the international human rights arena are usually powerful actors. They're not all tiny little organizations that are looking for translators to work for free. So you have different kinds of clients in that particular department. There are some organizations that are very, very tiny and they don't have a lot of resources and they don't have a very big budget for translation. But then you have your very, very large non-state actors like Amnesty or like the International Center for Transitional Justice or like the Ford Foundation. And they have a lot of money and they actually assign a lot of money for translation because they take it very seriously. They know that they have to pay good translators and they know that the organizations that depend on them will not be taken seriously if they can't communicate effectively in the HR arena. So when you approach these organizations, don't feel obligated to work for peanuts or don't feel obligated to work as volunteers. A lot of translators make this mistake. They initially walk up to an organization and say, I want to volunteer for you. And maybe the organization had money to pay you in the first place and was willing to pay you in the first place and wanted to pay you. But you went and you offered to do it for free because you thought that was the best way to help. And maybe that's not the best way to help because you have an opportunity cost. When you're working for these clients, you are not working for anybody else. You cannot use that time for any other client. And you still have to pay your rent, you still have to pay your bills, and you still have to eat. So you need to put that into the equation because if you're working for free for all of these clients, then you might actually find yourself not working as hard for them. And they need you to work really hard for them. So it's better to try to negotiate, good contracts with them. Okay, so I already talked about, another option are flat fees per job. The other thing that I think is important is that some of these organizations get really confused when you actually tell them, well, translators charge per word. And they're, well, how do we know? And then they start finding themselves limiting how many words they use in their reports because they're not sure if they're going to be able to afford you. And that's terrible because they might have a lot more to say and they're just afraid of going over with the words. So an option is just to offer them flat fees just for types of jobs. Once you figure out the kinds of documents that they normally develop, you can just tell them, okay, well, we'll just have this one fee. And if it's this kind of report, then I'll charge this much. And if it's a different kind of report, we'll charge this much. And if they go a little bit over, it's not a big deal for you. If they go a lot over, then you'll just renegotiate your agreement. So some of the things that I recommend doing if you're interested and if I've sold the human rights arena as an area of specialization, which I hope I have, is find a cause that you love for the obvious reason that when you're doing something that you really love, you do it better, I think. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's just how it works for me. And find organizations that advocate for that cause. You will be, once you start looking into this, you will be amazed at how many causes people actually take on in the human rights arena. I mean, it's just, it's tremendous. You have just incredible amounts of organizations working toward all sorts of different causes. So find one that really does something that you care about. And get formal academic training. I recommend really trying to take courses, university courses, and really reading up as much as you can. Unlike the business world where people don't really want to listen to academics and academic talk, in the human rights arena, we do want to listen to academic talk. We appreciate academic talk because academic talk is how we got things rolling in the first place. I mean, this is a lot of times when we look at the HR system, we think, well, if it hadn't been for World War II, we wouldn't have this. But actually, the intellectual movement that started this started 2,400 years ago. You know, we've been discussing all these issues for 2,400 years, and then finally someone went and did something really awful, and then we went and said, oh, let's do something practical with all this knowledge. But academia still plays a very, very important role in this. So when evaluating you and working with you, your academic background really is very important for your clients, and they are more likely to hire you if you have a strong academic background as they are if you have a lot of experience, but you don't necessarily have the academic training to back that up. They're a little bit reluctant. And also, you know, the businessy sort of those sales pitches that sound like sales pitches, you know, where they come up with these names like linguistic solutions, blah. You need to be a little bit more honest and just tell them, look, this is what I know. I know how to do this. I can help you in this way. And I have all this academic training that can back it up. Because, you know, these people they spend a lot of time thinking, you know, unlike other areas of business where everyone's in a hurry and everything happens really quickly. Here we actually take our time to think about what we're going to do a lot before we do it. What I don't recommend doing is to take on human rights causes just to start learning. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, I personally would not recommend that. I don't think it's a responsible way to go about it. Don't assume that their translation budgets are low. You can talk to them about it. I mean, people that work in the HR arena, like I said, are not really part of the business world. They don't have the same holdups as business people, and they will be a lot more honest with you about their budgets and their budget constraints or where they get their money from. I've had clients that actually tell me, well, you know, we get so much in donations from this foundation or that other foundation, so we can afford blah, and it's like 4 times more than what I charge anyway. So, you know, then you have a little integrity and you tell them, okay, no, look, you don't need to pay me that much. You can pay me less. It's fine. But, you know, sometimes they're really clueless. So it also helps them to have translators that, you know about how to budget a translation correctly. And don't take causes for clients who advocate for causes that you oppose. And I've seen this happen. For instance, I saw this happen once with a PPFA here in the US. There was a translator who was opposed to the cause, and it's perfectly respectable. I mean, you can oppose some of their causes, but then don't translate for this organization if you don't support their cause. And I talked to this translator, and she said, well, you know, they just offered me a really nice sum of money, but then I couldn't do the translation. And it was very detrimental to the translator, and it was very detrimental to the actual organization because the translator really just didn't do a good job because she didn't feel comfortable with the cause at hand. So I think that you really need to think about that, and don't think of organizations as just an area to make money. Think of them as you're supporting something that also happens to pay you. Last but not least, I encourage you to look in the right places. And the right places to look, of course, are directly with the human rights organizations, and look at the United Nations has a lot of information out there. They have glossaries. They have information about organizations that have legal personality to come and advocate before the UN. Look at large organizations, the really, really big ones like the ACLU. Look at who they work with. They also often cooperate with organizations, smaller organizations in other areas. So, I mean, you have a lot of places where you can look. Sell yourself correctly. Don't come with one of these cheap pitches. Just sell yourself as a professional who's committed to the cause. And definitely establish yourself as an expert in that particular field. So that's about it for this part of the presentation. But since we have a little time, I'm going to start taking questions if you have some. Did I talk too fast? I did, right? I'm sorry. Everyone tells me you need to slow down. I can't help myself. Yes? Yes. Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry?
Age limit doesn't matter if you're working as a freelancer.
Exactly. Oh, no, it doesn't really matter because what you're working with are non-state actors that are advocating before these organizations. So there are a lot of things that would normally matter if you were applying for the organization itself, a lot of the qualifications. If you look at the qualifications to work for the UN directly, some of them are impossible to meet for your average translator. And that actually has a historical reason. A while back, the UN used to only hire translators who came from very, very powerful families in certain countries. And the reason that they did that was because they were the only people that could speak the official languages in those countries. And then for a while, they only hired men. It wasn't until too long ago that they realized that they didn't have any women on staff, and then they slowly started incorporating women as well. There are also age limitations. There are limitations that have to do with education. And for some people in developing countries, for instance, they never, ever meet those expectations. It's impossible for people who come from a lower middle class family in a developing country to meet all the qualifications to be part of the permanent staff. So for those people, the option that they have is to work externally, work as freelancers for people who are doing stuff in the human rights arena. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
These organizations that you spoke with, are these organizations here in the United States or organizations that over in developed countries?
You have organizations all over the place.
Because the thing is that the concern here is that those organizations that are there,
Yeah.
they may not necessarily have money to pay you. And they usually, now I know that in the country where I'm from, for example, there's USAID,
Mm-hmm.
large organization, the organization, and they employ a lot of local translators and interpreters and people that help them that are bilingual or, being trained here in the U.S. So how do we get to work in these organizations that are already there,
Mm-hmm.
they're already employing these people, and then there's small ones that are, for example, the local government affiliated, but they don't have money to pay.
Okay, well, it's if they're playing in the international human rights arena already, it's not likely that they don't have money to pay. What's likely is that they don't know they're supposed to be paying their translators and interpreters. So a lot of times they will ask for volunteers, and they'll ask for volunteers for things that don't really matter much to them. They'll ask for volunteers, for instance, to translate their webpage. But then when it comes to sending out shadow reports, the organizations that make it to that level have support from larger organizations in developing countries. So, for example, the United States, France, England, they actually send out very large sums of money to aid smaller organizations in developing countries. And part of that is a specific budget for translation. And that's part of their budget. It's part of the money. It's the reason why these organizations are sending out money to them so that they can pay their translators and their interpreters to go out in the world and get their message across. So I'll get to you in a minute. So one thing that you can do, for instance, is you can look up who their donors are. I do that sometimes. I'll look up who the donor is. And if you see certain organizations that you know already have really good budgets for translations, then you know that that is an organization that is going to have resources to pay you as a translator. Smaller organizations may not have a budget at all, but they might not be in the international arena. They might just be trying to reach for it still, or just, denouncing stuff on social media, but they might not be doing any real advocating. Did you?
You talked about sometimes the client is, or the NSA, so clueless in terms of budget.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate in terms of the client education? We started the conference with the UN, obviously knows about the process.
Yeah.
What about the NSA actors? How do you see the client education status?
Okay, well, it's a good question. I've seen a lot of differences in clients. I work for a lot of different kinds of clients in several different countries. One of the things that I've noticed is that organizations that have some sort of direct tie to developed countries or that get their funding from developed countries are not that clueless. They know what they're doing, and they get a lot of assessment. Larger organizations, when they send out money to smaller organizations, they also have a lot of conditions, and they also teach them how to go about certain things. It's a lot different when you work with organizations that maybe started as grassroots organizations or that are working their way up. Those organizations are usually a lot more clueless. So in that case, you need to really work with them in terms of educating them about the importance of professional translation versus non-professional translation. I've actually helped clients figure out what stuff they should be paying for and what stuff they can just use volunteers or kids that are already working, with them, like emails that they send to their donors with, we did this, we did that, or, we saved the whale or whatever. They don't really need to pay me to do that. They need to pay me to get their stuff to the UN. They don't need to pay me for an email. So you can help them with that. You can help them figure out what stuff maybe they have in-house volunteers that are bilingual and that have an interest in translation that can help with very little things. And then you can guide them toward the things that are more important and that really require a professional translator to help them. But yeah, you do a lot of educating when they are smaller organizations. And if they're small enough, you will also do a lot of legal training. You actually end up teaching them a lot about international law, which is why in some cases a law degree might help. I have organizations that cannot afford lawyers because lawyers are expensive. And they're not lawyers. They're just people who really care about a cause, and they do the best they can to denounce violations, and they look at the treaties on their own, and they try to figure out how to explain that to the Human Rights Council, and they can't get a lawyer to help them do it. So sometimes it helps when their translator has a law degree because you can tell them, well, look, this means that, and maybe you can focus on this a little bit more than that. It's just up to you, though. That's just a personal choice. I'm not saying you should go around, but it might help. Do you have any other questions? Yeah.
Is the English and Translators that they need more in translation?
They use English a lot more for some reason, even though they could be into English. Yeah. Yeah, they try to go into English as much as possible. And it's weird because they could be going into other languages. They could be going into French, or they could be going into any of the other official languages and still be able to be part of the process. But for some reason, everyone seems to choose English. It just makes their life easier. It also has to do, in some cases, with how easy it makes them to get support on social media. Most of the people that read stuff online read in English. So if you have developed a lot of materials in English, then you get a lot more exposure, you get a lot more people supporting your cause, and it just makes their life a whole lot easier, and it makes it easier for them to get heard. So that's probably why they go into English so much more than other languages. Do we have any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Two aspects. One of them is a comment on globalization that
Mm-hmm.
is a bad connotation in certain countries. At the same time, there are companies that have branches in both sides, and they are global. So I work for a company which does interpretations,
Mm-hmm.
and we deal with human trafficking, with exploitation, and the different levels, like police or DHS or USCIS, and it's a lot of work as an interpreter at that level, not necessarily for that one of those organizations, but something lower level dealing with this. And another one is global compliance.
Mm.
The company located in the US, but
Yeah.
countries from all over the world call this company to report an employee
Yeah.
anonymously can call and report something. So there is something done about it.
Yeah, definitely. Global compliance is actually another huge area of opportunities for translators and for interpreters. Yeah.
You call and they report something and somebody else is following it.
Yeah.
The bad issue for interpreters is they expect us to comply. They don't even allow an interpreter to say, to introduce themselves. When I say this is John, I'm doing this, say, I didn't say that. Why do you say that? Because the other person has to know who I am here.
Yeah.
Speaking both languages. They don't allow me because they make a complaint.
Yeah.
Expecting an interpreter to be.
It's just a tool. Yeah.
The question I have for yourself or somebody else from Europe, maybe.
Okay.
I know Europe is working on those 23 languages with legal harmonization.
Mm-hmm.
Like HR would be also needing that kind of help. Is anybody working on that?
Do we have anyone working in harmonization?
Translating documents in European languages?
No?
They need a lot of work on that. So that's the working on it.
Yeah, that's another.
.com and others.
Yeah. Well, definitely people in Europe are probably a lot more into that right now than people here in the U.S. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Just had a comment of what you said about not taking on a job where you don't really agree with the cost.
Yeah.
You had the experience
Oh, definitely. Thank you for bringing that up, because people have a lot of holdups on saying no to jobs sometimes. Like, you think the client is never going to come back. But when you've established yourself as an expert in your field, people come back. I mean, it just happens. And another thing that I didn't mention, but should have, it just occurred to me while I was listening to you, is this area, the human rights area, also works a lot with word of mouth. You get one client, and little by little, you start getting a lot more clients. So the hardest thing is getting your foot through the door. Does that expression exist in English? Okay, because I just translated that from Spanish. I thought, this sounds wrong. Okay, that's the hardest part, getting your first client. But once you get a first client, if you do a really, really good job, they start recommending you. And they will recommend you to all the other organizations that cooperate with them. Because just like, you know how large companies have little tiny companies that all belong to the same company? Well, organizations, human rights organizations, kind of do the same thing. They cooperate with each other, and they create groups of organizations that all advocate for the same cause, and they pool all of their resources together. So sometimes you get a client that is a very tiny little client. Like I had this one tiny little client in Peru, and then it turned out this one tiny little client in Peru was working with a bunch of other organizations, and now they're all my clients. You know, so that happens a lot. Also, like I was saying earlier, if you get academic training, academics are also very prone to word of mouth. We do not like it when people advertise themselves too much. We actually work with people that we trust. So people who are in the academic world will tend to look at other academics, and they'll call up people at a certain university, and they'll be like, oh, look, this guy studied with you. You know, should I trust this translator or not? And we ask other academics if we should use this person or not. So that's another thing. If you join an academic community, you might actually find yourself in a situation where you can find clients through your academic community. They're closed very tightly, and they recommend each other. And if you are a student, what I do recommend is find a professor at your university that is working in the human rights field, because professors love working with young new students and, you know, helping them out. And a lot of them will write a lot and want to have that stuff translated as well. So that's another area of opportunity for students. And the professor will help you with the translation, because they're usually very involved in how you should be interpreting their words and what they're exactly what they're trying to express. Do we have any other questions? Yes, go ahead. Definitely.
And, you know, if you're more of a literary journalist, the Red Cross has offices, obviously, everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
That would be worth looking into in your local country to get the word out, to get awareness.
Yeah, and definitely look into American organizations that are going abroad. For example, here in the U.S., you have the Innocence Project, and the Innocence Project is expanding toward Latin America, and it's expanding toward Europe. And they are looking for translators like crazy in different language pairs, especially now that some countries have privatized their prison systems. Because now, you know, having criminals is a business. It's good for business, so people are arrested for whatever. And there's a lot of work to be done in that. We have 40 seconds. Does anyone have a question that I can answer? Okay, thank you. Okay.